In this video, we're going to talk through sermon prep for our first lesson in our How to Win It Parenting series. You can find this online. We're going to preach this together. We're actually going to team preach this on Sunday, and you'll see we're going to kind of swap off sections of the sermon. So we're going to just take some time to talk through that right now so that as you're prepping this, whether you're going to preach it yourself or maybe for you in your context, you'll have your wife preach it with you also. I think it'll make it a lot more interesting, as you'll see. So we're going to walk through that right now. So take a look at those notes below as we go through it with you.
So as you see here in the intro, we really want to hook parents by identifying some of the more common ways parents try to, well, in their mind, think that they're being intentional and having a plan with their kids. You know, we start preschool when they're way too young. We pay lots of money on club teams because we want them to be good at sports. Things like that. Just trying to get a hook for parents that they could feel like, okay, yeah, I relate to that example.
And you'll notice there that there's a bonus video that you can download. It's just a short little video, Do You Live Up to Your Parents' Dreams? And we're going to actually insert it right there even after we've started the sermon. Now, you'll also notice there that I've inserted my own personal example. So coming out of that video, again, that short video with just a bunch of people sharing their answer to the question, what were your parents' dreams for you? I'm going to answer that for myself because we're going to start the sermon with me probably up there. So I would just encourage you, just be careful about that when you're sharing your own dreams. As Tracy said to me, if you're the perfect child, don't share that. I'm gonna actually make a joke right there about how my dad said that I could be president if I wanted to be, and he meant that as a compliment. And then I'm going to say, well, now I'm wondering if he meant that as his goal for me. So I'm going to try to make that kind of light. Remember, in your sermon intro, keep it light. You want it to be introductory, and more than anything, you're going to try to hook them. And the hook here, as Tracy said, the hook here is, and what we're going to be talking about in this whole lesson is when you're purposeful about parenting, then you can define the win. And you can make sure you're actually winning rather than just sort of unintentionally parenting. And so keep that in mind, even as you listen to our sermon prep video here. That's kind of what you're going for. Remember, try to be clear. Try to be as clear as you can in your own mind, even as you listen to us explain where we're going and what the trajectory of the sermon is. Now, from there, I'm going to get into the example of King David. And you'll see that first slide is that David was the greatest king in the history of Israel, but he was a failure as a father. And so that slide will stay up as I explain just that whole idea. Now, I'm specifically going to just reference this story with David's son Amnon and his half-sister Tamar, and how because David responded in weakness, he didn't discipline. The result of that was a couple years later, Absalom kills Amnon. And so we see that just the result of David's lack of intentional parenting there. Now, I'm going to use a slide for another story, a related story, when Absalom's younger brother, later on, Adonijah, plotted to steal the throne of David. And it's interesting what it says there, and that's that next slide. It says, now his father, King David, had never disciplined him at any time, even by asking, why are you doing that? And I'm going to focus on that particular concept there, just even that verse that says that David never disciplined him at any time, and he never even said, why are you doing that? He never even challenged him. Now, obviously, I think that relates way back to when Adonijah was young and probably just David's way of parenting. He wasn't purposeful. As purposeful as he was with his wars and even with his women, he wasn't very purposeful with his parenting, and we see the result in David's life. I mean, it really was a failure. Now, probably right there, I'm going to share another personal example of how my parents disciplined me. And in my case, I'm going to say, now, this would not have been written about my father or my mother because they were very good at disciplining. Probably share a little funny example of a time they disciplined. And again, keep it light and mix in my own example. Trying to get people to think about, am I purposeful or not? And that will lead to the next section in the sermon, which Tracy's going to take and get up and preach that next section.
Okay, so coming out of those examples, then we go to the next slide, and here's the talking point. King David didn't fail on purpose as a parent. He failed because he didn't parent on purpose. So here it's just going to be important to emphasize, as parents, we come home with our kids from the hospital, and all of a sudden it's like, we're in charge. What are we supposed to do? And you think about any other thing that we embark on in life, a business, When you buy a house or a car, we do research, we plan, we save our money, we do all these things to prepare for it. Yet with parenting, oftentimes we just kind of thrust ourselves into the role and think it's just going to kind of take care of itself. And so usually what happens with that then is if we're not parenting on purpose or with a plan, if we don't have a strategy or a mission or what we even want to accomplish as parents or what we want our kids to turn out to be, then we're just kind of lost, flailing around with no direction. And in the end, that's going to be hurtful to our kids.
Yeah, and that's probably how you're going to actually preach that. Notice it's not real preachy. She's just explaining it just like that. Real simple explanation. So then the goal is to encourage them to be clear and purposeful. In fact, we have a related topic there called getting 5-point clarity on parenting. So one of us will probably mention that, encourage people to check that out. We won't have time to go over that in the sermon, but if you want to check that out as you're prepping for the sermon, it probably would be helpful because the 5-point clarity link talks about mission, vision, values as parents, what your strategy is as a parent. So that'll be really helpful. Again, that's for maybe a small group or a mentoring context, or even for a husband and a wife to do together as a follow-up to the sermon. And keep in mind that this sermon really is going to probably trigger a lot of those kinds of conversations. Maybe at your church, you're going to make sure to offer a parenting class or offer a parenting workshop afterward at the end of this 3-week series. Because there's a lot here. But one of the points that we make in this particular section is that when you parent without clarity, you tend to be reactive in your parenting rather than being proactive in your parenting. And actually, we're going to encourage you to share an example of that for yourself in that sermon. So Tracy, do you want to share what your example would be for that particular situation?
Well, I'm kind of deciding if it's going to be more lying or blatant disobedience. So for me, when the kids were young and I would catch one of my kids in a lie or, they got caught doing something. And then when I ask them about it, it's a kind of a half-truth or just an all-out lie. Sometimes as parents, we can kind of look at that and be like, they're 5. What do they know? But the problem with that is if you don't start disciplining that and shaping that in your kids, that telling the truth every time and all the time is really important. And if you don't attach a consequence when they choose the lie over the truth, then you're creating kind of a snowball effect that the older they get, the more they learn. Okay, I can manipulate mom and dad. I can leave out this part of the story, or I can tell a lie. And the problem is, as our kids get older, the lies have more consequences, right? So when they're 5 and I asked my daughter if she was in my perfume and I can smell it all over her hands, so I knew the truth and she lies to me, that's one thing. But if it's where have you been and whose house were you at after school when she's 15, that has some different consequences to it if I haven't trained in her the importance of telling the truth.
Yeah, and so remember, at this point in the sermon, we're really still sort of setting up the whole problem with parenting without purpose, without a plan, without clarity. And so right here, then, my transition, and this will transition back into my section of the sermon. I'm gonna transition by saying, have you given much thought for you yourself to the right path for your kids? Because after Tracy's example, hopefully people are going to be thinking, yeah, I've done that 100 times. I'm a reactive parent. I never really thought about it. Maybe I'm reactive because I haven't really been purposeful. And that transitions right into the next section where we talk a little bit more about the need for getting your kids on the right path. In fact, it's a lie in today's culture to let the kids discover their own path. The slide for this section says this: without the guidance of parents, many kids will default to a path of selfishness and destruction. And we'll go right to the Proverb 22:6 from there. Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So again, the emphasis here is going to be on that idea of there is a way that kids should go. That's not what our culture tells us, but that is what the Bible tells us. The Bible says that parents should train them up, that there is a direction. We should put our kids on a vector. We shouldn't just let them just follow their hearts, right? So that's what we're emphasizing in this particular section. We should have a plan. We should be purposeful as parents. We shouldn't just let them just go wherever they want, right? So now some people might be listening to that if they're not believers, and they might have to be convinced about that. So just be aware of that with your congregation in mind. But there's a couple of notes that we have there in my sermon notes I want you to take a look at real quick. The first note is that we're not talking about raising holier-than-thou kids who separate themselves from regular people, but we're talking about young people who learn how to think critically about the secular world that they live in and that they really buy into the worldview of Jesus. Now, depending on your church, depending on your congregation, you might really need to emphasize this. Maybe you don't need to emphasize this, but I just know on this particular case, in this particular section, I think some parents might mistakenly think that we're saying that we want to raise kids who are just like out of the world, separated from the world. And I know we're very sensitized to that. We don't want a church filled with Christian parents who think that the idea is to get them to be separatists and to not have friends and to not sort of engage in the world. So we're not just trying to, and we have to figure this out with our own kids, 13 and 15, our kids are. But we're always trying to encourage them, listen, be in the world, but don't be of the world. So when it says train up a child in the way they should go, we're not trying to train up these Christians that can't really relate to all the other kids. So just be aware of that. I know we're probably going to address that briefly in the sermon itself. And so for you in your context, you also might want to address that. But the second note, probably this is even more obvious, is some people bristle against that verse because some people think that verse says that it's a promise that if you're a godly parent, your kids will be godly. And then conversely, if your kids aren't godly, and just be aware of this as you're preaching this sermon, some parents might just be sitting there just with guilt and shame because their adult kids aren't pursuing God or something like that. So really try to be sensitive to that. I know we're going to try to be sensitive to that in our sermon. We're going to say, listen, this isn't a promise. This is a proverb. It's a principle. It's talking more about our responsibility as parents to do our part. But it's not saying automatically that if you do your part as parents, that your kids will automatically be great kids and love Jesus, okay? So just maybe be ready to make that note. It shouldn't be a major sidetrack, but be ready to make that note at this point in the sermon.
So moving into this next section, then, we're going to transition to, so what exactly is the course that we should chart for our kids? So we highlight a few of the examples, of what our culture would tell us is, well, your kids should follow their heart. Whatever makes them happy, whatever gets them excited, that's what they should do. That's success. Or be successful, make your money, get a prestigious job, go to a great university, be the best, get the, MVP on your sports teams or get the lead role in the musical. And then, move out. I think a lot of parents look forward to the idea of not having to have the financial burden of kids and to be free to go do what they want. So those are just a couple of the examples, probably the most popular answers. Maybe a normal parent out there who is not a believer would say, well, I think I've done well if those three things are in play. And the truth is, those aren't bad answers. They're just not complete answers. There's more to the story than just those three things. So that's where we want to introduce this idea of going full circle. This idea that we're really winning as parents if we get our kids to trust Jesus, to live to honor him, and then help other people to grow in their relationship with God.
And we're going to use that image, and depending on your campus and your church, if you use foundations regularly for our church, it is foundational for our church. So we're always defining the win in terms of these three things. We're going to throw that image up there, and we're going to just make sure that we share personal examples in our own life where we as parents have gone full circle and we're trusting Jesus and honoring God and helping others. And to me, this is one of the most important parts of the sermon is to say, and again, we're talking to Christian parents now, but if you're a Christian parent and you aren't really thinking purposefully about helping your kids go full circle, this really is the win. In fact, you'll see that's the slide there in the notes, in the sermon. The slide says the goal of Christian parenting is to raise kids who pursue God full circle. So this is really the part in the sermon where you can challenge parents to, make sure that they're going full circle. Are they wholehearted full circle Christians? Are they trusting Jesus? Are they honoring God in their life? And are they helping others? And maybe this is also a great place to make the appeal to maybe the seekers in the crowd who are parents, to say, listen, if you're here today and you've never gone through foundations, we encourage you to do that, to go through foundations and make sure that you're winning as a pursuer of God, because what'll happen, and this is the close of the sermon, is that when you do that, you'll really be successful. That's what that last slide says, 1 Kings 2. Back to David at the end of his life, he says, I'm going to where everyone on earth must someday go. Take courage and be a man. Observe the requirements of the Lord your God and follow all his ways. Keep his decrees, commands, regulations, and laws written on the law of Moses so that, and here's the key part, You will be successful in all you do and wherever you go. Now that's the ending slide right there, and we're specifically using that word there, you will be successful, because after all, the name of the series is How to Win at Parenting. And so if you want to be successful, if you want to win at parenting, then you should teach your kids to go full circle. That's the most purposeful way to parent your Christian kids, is to help them to pursue the God of the Bible. When you do that, you'll be successful in your parenting. So hopefully that's helpful. I know this was a long video, but we wanted to do this, and we encourage you to watch this a few times so that you can understand from our perspective the flow of the sermon. Make sure to insert your own examples there. There's a lot of stuff here, so this sermon's got to go fairly quickly, or it's going to be a 50-minute sermon, especially with Tracy and I do it. We're going to be tag teaming. I think that'll make it actually a little longer. So if you're going to tag team, just be aware of that. Make sure you try to keep it to the time restraints that you like to have at your church. Thanks for watching. In the next video, we're going to talk about week 2, lesson 2 in this series, where we're going to talk about creating the right environment for your home as a parent.